Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carmelita Nuki, the Executive Director of DAWN and the President of the Philippine Migrants' Rights Watch. Welcome to our second webinar on gender-based violence and migrants' rights. As a brief background, we all know that COVID-19 is a worldwide pandemic, and in the Philippines, it has affected all sectors of society, including migrant women returnees and those in the destination countries displaced from their respective workplaces. A major issue that they are currently confronted with is mental health due to distress and possible trauma brought about by the pandemic. Many migrant women workers were forced to return home scarred or trapped in the country of destination, afraid and anxious for their individual welfare and well-being as well as that of their families. Our October webinar series were held with our migrant women returnees and their families and migrant women workers in the destination countries to facilitate, assist, and address the pressing concerns of the individual migrant women returnees and migrant women workers and their families. The second series of webinars this November will focus on training of service providers. The series of webinars aim to enhance the existing skills and capacities of service providers on mental health and psychosocial services in order to effectively respond to migrant women returnees and migrant women workers in the destination countries and members of their families amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. We also need to identify current issues and challenges experienced by service providers on the area of MHPSS, identify and strengthen the appropriate response and support mechanisms among service providers. It is in this regard that we invited you to this 4-webinar series organized by Dawn in partnership with the British Embassy Manila. Today's webinar on gender-based violence and migrants' rights is the second of the 4 training workshops on mental health and psychosocial services. The first was the webinar on MHPSS, Psychological First Aid, Stress Management and Coping Strategies, which was held last Tuesday, November 17. Once again, welcome everyone, our welfare officers, social welfare attaches, DSWD field officers, social workers and staff, representatives of NGOs and recruitment agencies for joining our training workshop. We hope that we'll have a fruitful discussion. Thank you. And now let me introduce to you our 2 distinguished guests, speakers, and trainers. First, we have Professor Aurora Havate de Dios. She's the current Senior Project Director of the Women and Gender Institute after serving as its Executive Director for 10 years. WAGI is a specialized center for feminist learning and teaching, as well as research and training at Miriam College in the Philippines. Professor De Dios has a long academic career as the former college dean and professor at the International Studies of Miriam College. She is currently finishing her PhD in Organizational Development. She held various government positions as the Philippine representative to the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of Women and Children's Rights from 2010 to 2017. Chair of the National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women in 2001 to 2003. She's a member of the UN Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the UNCEDAW, where she became rapporteur from 1994 to 1998. Presently, Professor Oye sits as an alternative member of the Philippine Interagency Council Against Trafficking in Persons and a member of the CHED Technical Panel on Gender and Women's Studies. Professor De Jos is the president of the DAWN Board of Trustees and the president of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women International and its Asia Pacific chapter. Professor De Jos was member and chair of the External Forum on Gender of the Asian Development Bank and works as gender consultant and trainer on women's rights, CEDAW, trafficking and migration issues, as well as gender peace and security with various ASEAN governments, government agencies in the Philippines, as well as international organizations and NGOs. And our next speaker, trainer, is Dr. Jean Encinas Franco. She is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science of UP Diliman. Dr. Jean works on issues relating to gender and the politics of migration. So now, let me call on Professor Aurora Habate de Jos for her presentation. Professor Oye, please.
Hello, magandang hapon sa ating lahat. This afternoon, we will have two sections. I think first is on migrant rights and then on gender-based violence against migrant women. And then I think the second part will have to do with psychological and assistance, that our experts will also share with us. So just a small background about DAWN. DAWN has been around for more than 20 years, and I've been involved for that long in this organization that initially was helping Filipino entertainers to Japan and their children. Since many of those children that DAWN have assisted are now doctors, social workers, teachers, and it's a tribute to DAWN that they saw through the life journey of children who had issues about their identity, etc. And also the women have become empowered and are now doing their livelihood projects with DAWN. But DAWN has also expanded to include migrant in the promotion of migrant rights, as well as assisting migrant returnees. So this is all part of the program of DAWN. So my session will touch on the challenges in implementation of women migrant rights and the protection measures in the time of COVID. So I'm aware that a lot of us are coming from different government agencies that are in the front line of dealing with these issues that we have now, massive numbers of migrants coming back because of the lack of opportunities, as well as the crisis that's also happening in the host countries. So very simply, my presentation will have two objectives. One is to understand the vulnerabilities of women migrant workers, especially aggravated by the COVID pandemic. The second is to review women migrant rights and protection measures and address the challenges in their implementation at this time when it's very hard to implement those rights. Nandiyan na ba yung aking PowerPoint? Okay. Okay. So anyway, andun na ako sa objective, and the first slide, please. I'd like just to quote this IOM senior specialist who said that whether we like it or not, the second, next please. Next slide, please. Okay. Migration has changed, probably permanently. And the question will be, in what ways and how can we ensure that migrant workers and migrants in general are protected? So the change that she's referring to is, of course, the kind of drastic change as a result of the pandemic. And in what way can we preserve and sustain and support the rights of migrants, which we had worked very hard for in the last decades. So just, I know that Jean might also point out this, but just a review of certain basic facts about women migrant workers. I know we should cover a lot more ground, but for us today, we're concerned with women migrant workers. Next slide, please. Uh, the one thing that we have noticed, of course, in migration in the last so many decades is the feminization of migration, uh, meaning that many women on their own are going abroad to work for their families. And in fact, in the Philippines, there are more female OFWs than male OFWs, comprising about 55.8. And they are in the prime of their years. No? 47.5 are young, sometimes from 25 to 34. Nako, ito yung pinaka-productive years. Next, please. And as we can see, the majority of our women workers are in Asia, but Asia is also includes the Middle East as well as Southeast Asia. So if you notice, these are, in fact, the majority, Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and then of course Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other ASEAN countries. Next, please. So this is just to demonstrate that most of the women migrant workers are in what is called elementary occupations, which is to say that they are doing domestic work. So they are the majority of our women OFWs. Next, please. Okay, the point has been raised that although all workers need protection, we are focusing on why women need protection in this instance. As we have seen, the kinds of work that they do are in the low-paid, vulnerable jobs like domestic work. We call it vulnerable because whether they like it or not, they are subjected to multiple discrimination based on class, gender, ethnicity, and occupational category. In some cultures, domestic work is seen as akin to slavery, and the treatment of domestic workers is very low, and that translates to sometimes ill treatment of those women workers. And the other vulnerability lies in the fact that domestic work is, in many contexts, is not considered work and are therefore not subject to supervision as well as standard compensation as well as other protections. The other dimension of domestic work is that they are almost always subjected to different kinds of abuse, exploitation, as well as sexual violence. In my limited exposure in UAE, I have seen how this is practically, an everyday occurrence in embassies where these runaway domestic workers seek refuge when they are molested, when they are exploited, etc. And many are saying this is just, a small number compared to the ones found in Saudi Arabia and in other Middle Eastern countries. Next, please. So the one thing that we are trying to understand now is that given all these previous vulnerabilities that we have seen, uh, there is another layer of aggravation na nakikita natin ngayon. Ito yung COVID-19 pandemic. Ang kaibahan nito sa ibang pandemic is that SARS, Ebola, and MERS-CoV were all temporary and localized, no, affecting only specific countries. Whereas COVID strikes every country in the world today, both host countries as well as receiving countries as well as sending countries. And secondly, that this COVID-19 um, is so prolonged that we cannot even see the day when we don't have COVID-19. So give or take 1 or 2 years would be, we've already done 1 year and still here, no sign of the end of COVID. Of course, the lockdowns and travel bans affect the employment and wages of foreign workers, limit everyone's mobility. And migration is, of course, a mobile phenomenon, and you need to travel in order to get to work in other countries. Um, so for women migrant workers, the pandemic increased their work demands and caretaking responsibilities for members of the household. Kung dati, sa araw wala yung mga bossing, medyo magaan sila. Pero ngayon, everyone has to stay home, and therefore it requires more responsibility because you're serving more people who are staying at home. They therefore, increase their responsibility to clean, cook, take care of children, and even the elderly, in addition to cleaning and disinfecting homes. Also compounding their, next please, compounding their difficulties, the requirements of many countries is that they have to have COVID tests and certificate in order to move around, which they sometimes cannot afford. And of course, the reality is that as soon as many of the countries, as soon as they realize it's going to be a long-term problem, have easily dismissed many of the women migrant workers. Therefore, creating such a huge absence of not only the dismissal of workers means that there are no remittance forthcoming to their families back home. Many organizations are now trying to monitor the incidents of human rights violation, and at least in Qatar, they saw many workers rounded up and expelled, as well as in other areas in the Middle East, which are quite notorious for these incidents. I think next, please. This is something that we have already taken note of, but just a special mention regarding undocumented migrants, of which we have thousands from the Philippines. If before they're subjected to repression, now it's even more restrictive because they face constant threats of arrest, detention, and immediate deportation as a result of the pandemic. Next, please. I have a table here of, I gathered this from an IOM list of vulnerabilities of migrants during pandemic. Okay, pakibaba ng konti. So when we say vulnerabilities, it's not that they are weak or unable to without agency, but that the situation creates the vulnerability. So for example, limited awareness of what's happening, ano ba itong COVID, paano ba tayo protektahan ng sarili, simply because many of the notices as well as warnings in many countries are not translated into understandable language that is that can be understood by migrants. It's always in English or French, or which are beyond the comprehension of many migrants. Also, because they live out of the household, for those who are working as domestic, they have to rely on public transportation, and their continued exposure uh, in on an everyday basis to other people, coupled with their limited access to hygiene items, make them very vulnerable to exposure and contamination. Uh, so also they lack entitlement to healthcare, and if there is a healthcare program of the host country, surely they are in the bottom of the ladder in terms of provision of health services. Uh, then most of the services are also located in the central cities, and many underserved locations such as the provinces and far off areas that is not accessible do not receive such health services. Um, Willingness to come forward also for assistance due to fear of arrest and or stigmatization, particularly among our undocumented. Of course, the lockdowns have isolated and rendered our migrants more vulnerable because their inability to communicate to family members. If in case of death or sickness, um, those who are the proper burial of deceased relatives, and I have encountered some of my friends whose immediate assistance were how to bury their dead. Uh, and this creates a lot of anxiety, particularly when they are stranded or have fear of being arrested or become victims of trafficking. Um, the greater part of the instability and uncertainty of many migrants is loss of their jobs and non-inclusion in COVID income support schemes, housing provision or rental subsidies, or other financial assistance. So all of these require measures to extend assistance to migrant workers that are, the responsibility of our government workers, particularly those who are assigned abroad. There are, of course, instruments that we can invoke, like ILO 97 and other bilateral agreements where they exist, and the mobilization of services from both public and private sources, such as NGOs, should be explored, because I think here the assistance of uh, Filipino communities abroad is crucial. And where there are no Filipino communities to rely on, our government officials have to rely on the labor and welfare services for migrants of the host country. So these are just some of the vulnerabilities that have been recorded by ILO. Next, please. Now, I'd like to focus on what are some of the conditions that will enable us to help migrants before and during the pandemic. First, we need to remember that there exist national and international laws affecting migrants, and this has been institutionalized. And in those countries where human rights is very strong, are really observed by the governments there, particularly in Europe, the US, uh, in to some extent some of the Asian countries. The second enabling condition for our migrants is the existence of democratic space for civil society, where there are NGOs that are actively promoting migrant rights, in both sending and receiving countries. Of course, there are areas such as in the Middle East where NGOs are not even allowed to exist. So the burden of assistance then falls on the government and the Filipino communities. And the third, I think this is of relevance, although I don't think it can cover most of the needs of migrants, are regional and bilateral formal agreements, as well as informal and non-binding processes and arrangements, at the very least, bringing attention to the concerns and problems of migrants during the pandemic. So these three conditions, where they exist, can lighten the load and the burden of our migrants during the pandemic. Next, please. So let's go look at the international multilateral treaties and agreements. Of course, we have in place the Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers. And here, the United Nations, as well as migrant rights groups, are strongly promoting protection for migrant workers in their during these uncertain times. Monitoring of human rights violations, I think all the conventions impact on the situation of migrants, and potentially they can also be a framework for protection. Next, please, particularly as regards human rights violations. Now, where protection measures are involved, we need to look at what our national governments can do when our migrant workers are still in the host countries or the receiving countries. So we have a whole country approach in our migration policy, and a greater part of the work of embassies is to provide assistance to our workers, migrant workers, and labor attaches and social welfare officers are crucial in this particular period, particularly when our migrant workers are displaced, or suddenly dismissed from their work. This is the time that we can invoke the bilateral agreements on migrant protection. I think we have about 12 or so. That includes comprehensive health and social protection, humanitarian assistance, and other types of assistance that are due citizens but should also apply to our migrant workers. But the limitation in this is that we don't have bilateral agreements in every country where they are needed. Going now to those that have returned to the Philippines, and after the crisis that they have experienced abroad, the viability of a reintegration program of the government the reintegration program has been for a long time, but its viability is now tested to the limits because of the magnitude, the numbers of returning migrants, which is in some estimates about 300,000 plus. So these massive numbers have already overwhelmed the whole government machinery, and now been grappling with some of the issues of coordination, as well as timeliness of government assistance. But I think this is a work in progress, and government is trying to make these programs achieve its objectives. Emergency relief programs of government are continuing, but are never really sufficient nor timely. And there is a need for better coordinated processing of migrant COVID treatment, as well as timely in transportation to the provinces of our migrant returnees. Next, please. Now, as far as the protection measures are concerned, there are, of course, ongoing challenges. What I have mentioned are some of the established instruments, but I think the test of the pudding is in the eating, no? Gumagana ba ito? Ito ba ay ginagalang ng mga bansa na marami tayong OFWs? So isang challenge dito ay yung lack of legal documentation or status of our migrant workers abroad, particularly the undocumented. And even if they are documented, yung kulang-kulang ang papel, ang mga passport ay napaso or things like that, can increase the risk for abuse by state actors. And during the pandemic, filing a complaint or criminal charge is something that our OFWs don't want to do because they fear being deported, no? And so this results in very little power and the absence of recourse. Many victims and survivors of violence against women do not have sufficient knowledge of services that are available, the presence, for example, of crisis centers where they exist, mostly in Europe. They also have barriers that they have to face, like paano sila magko-complain, ang alam nila ay Ilocano, hindi naman sila marunong mag-French. No? So language, and of course, lack of support system where there are no Filipino communities they can run to or no embassies inside. So many of them just tolerate the violence, which in many cases have become systematic and normalized. Now, some of the frameworks, the legal frameworks for protection are already there. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. Ano ba ang mga rights that should be respected by employers? So at the time of, during the pandemic, and in normal times as well, employers should take into account the specific needs of migrant workers in their context, including cultural, religious, and linguistic differences, among others. So, yung bang mga pangangailangan ng mga migrants na magkaroon sila ng kaalaman, halimbawa sa COVID, meron bang mga information materials that are available that are translated into language that are understood by our migrant workers? Yung bang kanilang kultura, religion, at saka yung kanilang language ay binibigyan ng pansin para matulungan at this time, no? Yung mga hindi nakakaabot na mga serbisyo. Lalo na sa, next please, as far as domestic workers are concerned, karamihan dito, sabi ko nga, the last in the list. No? Sila yung pinakahuli na nakakaranas ng serbisyo at kung kadalasan ay walang necessary hygiene measures in their workplace and clear information. Lalong-lalo na kung yung mismong mga employers nila ay mayroon ding sakit, no? In other contexts, like for example in the Philippines, pag nagkaroon ng maraming may sakit o may kaagad-agad ay sinususpend ang trabaho. In our bank, for example, near Katipunan, ay sarado siya since yesterday. And we wonder why. And we are surmising that there are COVID-19 affected workers. So, sinara na buong bangko so as not to expose their co-workers as well as the clients. No? So, sa domestic work setting, mukhang walang ganong precaution, no? Because they just assume that domestic workers will work 24 hours without any protection. Also, just because there's a pandemic, there's also a need for the employers to respect the weekly rest days or vacations of domestic workers. And because it is the restriction is for everybody, that if they cannot go out, that they should be provided with some means, preferably digital means, to communicate with their relatives back home. So ito na yung mga practical na mga pangangailangan. Next, please. Also, I think, and we're nearing the end of this sharing, migrants must have their documents in order so that they can access health services on COVID. So, isa sa pinakamalaking problema ng mga migrants natin ay yung kakulangan sa dokumento. And I think if this is the case, then the embassies as well as our social welfare officers should be ready to lend a helping hand, particularly when the documents to be obtained are not easily accessible. And then lastly, I think this is the last of it, migrants should be assured of their employment without undue dismissal uh, and termination of their work according to their contracts. So it cannot be the case where employers can just dismiss their migrants even if they have contracts using the excuse of the pandemic. So this should be asserted by the government and the migrants themselves. Even during times of crisis, migrants have their rights and they have a right to assert those rights. So I think that's the end of my presentation, very short presentation. Just to summarize that migrant rights are not suspended because of the pandemic. They have to be protected just as even during the time of pandemic and in normal times. Secondly, the situation of migrant workers of abuse, exploitation, and sexual violence tend to be more accentuated during the time of the pandemic. Mas maraming aggravation, mas naha-heighten yung vulnerabilities, and therefore the government and our officers, sa welfare officers, sa embassies, have to be alert in making adjustments and working towards the protection of our migrant workers, including the availability of dalawang bagay, availability of language, friendly, migrant-friendly language, and secondly, the ability to communicate through digital means. And lastly, I think that the migrant rights protections are there, but in reality, they can be breached by the host countries. And in this situation, we need the assistance of not only government assistance, but NGOs as well as civil society actors. So, marami pong salamat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oye, for that very informative presentation and comprehensive one. Now let me call on Dr. Jean Encinas Franco for her presentation. Dr. Jean, please.
Share ko lang
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I'm Jean Encinas Franco, Associate Professor in UP, and welcome to this webinar. I'd like to congratulate Ms. Mel Nuki, Executive Director of DAWN, and her staff and officers. They've worked very hard for this types of advocacies for many years now, and I have been a witness to that. And I also welcome our participants. As I can see, ang daming mga OWA officers from all parts of the world, and congratulations on the hard work that you do, especially in this time of pandemic. I know how difficult it is to be posted abroad now and to take care of our OFWs. What I'm going to talk about today is about women migrants and their situation and why they are prone to gender-based violence. And indeed, as Ma'am Oy earlier said, during crisis situations, especially now with the pandemic, there are many uncertainties, and this is something very new. The lockdown has been unprecedented. This has never before occurred in any part of the world. And so gender-based violence that are usually committed against migrant women tend to be heightened. And why is this the case? Um, I'd like to inform you, although many of you may already know this, that women migrants have not been previously given attention by policymakers and academics. The notion was that women migrate because they are mere dependents of men who migrate. Um, Before, the notion was that men were really the breadwinners and just women and their children are mere dependents of men. No, however, currently, almost half of all migrants in the world, according to the data from the World Bank, is that all almost half of all migrants, or 47%, uh, of migrants all over the world are women, according to the World Bank. Okay. Um, Mel, nakikita ba yung video ko? Ay, yung PowerPoint? Lance?
Okay yung
Nakikita po
PowerPoint.
yung PowerPoint, ma'am, pero wala pong video.
Can you please open your video?
Ah, ganun?
Opo.
Sorry. Ala. Dali. Sorry. Wala pa din?
Video, wala pa. Pero PowerPoint okay naman.
Okay. Maybe because I'm screen sharing? Hindi ba ganun? Yeah.
Ganun ba
Ah,
yan?
hindi ba? Wait,
Hindi. Oo, pwede rin naman makita maski nag-screen share.
Wait, wait. How about that? Wala pa rin?
Wala pa rin. Ha?
Hmm?
Saan si Sin?
Wala pa rin po ba? Try nyo lang i-on off lang po ulit yung camera.
Subukan mo kaya, Sin, ikaw nang mag-ano.
Ayan.
Ayan. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just also tell you about some of the myths that I have come to know about women migrants. No, although we are always saying, and indeed this is also true, that migrants are often victims. But what I'm trying to say is that they are not always victims. No, some migrants have actually made a name for themselves in other countries, and that they're not, I mean, most migrants have not actually been, what you call this, abused or exploited. They came on their own accord to other countries to empower themselves and to get liberated from some sort of a not very good environment that they are in here in the Philippines, whether it's about family problems or about poverty or about unequal uh, opportunities, no, employment opportunities. My women migrants are also not the same. Not all of them are the same, meaning to say, um, they all come from different classes, different backgrounds, different educational attainments, that they are not all poor, which is often the way they are portrayed, and that the reasons for migrating are purely economic. Studies indicate that not all migrants go out of the country because they want to earn a living. Some would want to what you call this, as I've said earlier, to be empowered, to get liberated from traditions that they are in here in the Philippines. Although, of course, the reason for seeing the world comes with them working abroad is something that other migrants have also uh, what they call this said in some interviews and in some studies. No, some migrants usually go out because they're just purely curious about the world. But of course, there are also migrants who really get out of the country, especially those who are in domestic work purely for economic reasons, and also because they want to what you call this upgrade or alleviate themselves from poverty. The other myth about migrant women is that their absence in the home leads to family breakdown. That's not always the case. Of course, there are stories about family breakdowns that have been portrayed in the media, but then there are also successful situations where the husband has managed to sort of transform the gender roles in the family. They have learned to be house husbands, and that their kids were okay when they grow up. No, the other myth about women migrants is that their work abroad reflects their educational attainment. This is not necessarily the case, because in fact most women migrants are the skilled, meaning to say their educational attainment when they are here in the Philippines uh, is not necessarily commensurate with the job that they got when they are abroad. I'm sure you know all of this because of the work that you do. Now, why am I enumerating all of these? Primarily because when we create or design programs and interventions on women migrants, of course, it is usually the case, especially when we work in government, that we have some sort of a generic formula as to how to implement the programs. That is an advantage when you work in government, because you tend to allocate a budget for it, and also you need to define the target audience, no, the target beneficiaries. But then the sad part, or the unfortunate side of having a generic program, is that sometimes we create programs that do not necessarily run parallel to what we call the lived experiences of women migrants. No, sometimes we assume, for instance, that the migrant, because she is a domestic worker, we assume that the migrant has absolutely no skills, when in fact this woman migrant might have actually been a an educator before leaving for work abroad, or the caregiver might actually have been a nurse. It's such that she did not acquire a job that she badly needed when she was here in the Philippines. That's why she opted for a caregiving job, no? But this is also a function of the fact that the POEA, I think, no, lists down or account for women migrants in terms of their job categories, no, and not really their educational background, which is understandable because they work on contract, no, on contract basis. And if the POEA accounts for it based on the job contract, the job written in their contracts. Oh, wait. Um, as we all know, the Philippines has had a long history of labor migration, and one of the first batch of women migrant professionals, are our nurses, and our the state sponsorship of labor out migration or overseas employment began in 1974 with the institutionalization of the labor code. And the feminization of migration, which we will define later on, actually began in the 70s and 80s. For instance, when a lot of civil society and church-based organizations opposed the sex tours that have been happening here by sex tours by Japanese men who want to sort of quote unquote rest and recreate here in the Philippines. And then these uh, sex tours were transformed into um, labor migration, meaning to say instead of the Japanese men coming to the Philippines, it's the Filipino women who were asked to go to Japan to serve as entertainers. And then when the Middle East also, because of the oil boom, um, became a wealthy country, most women, uh, as a form of social status, required domestic workers in their households, such that beginning in the 1980s, the Philippines also uh, have had a distinctive outmigration of domestic workers to the Middle East. At the same time, because of the rise of newly industrialized countries in Asia, particularly East Asia, no, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, factory workers became in demand in these parts of the world, and it also served as a catalyst for Filipino women migrant workers to work in these countries. What what we're trying to describe, no, is what has been called as the feminization of migration. So ano ba itong feminization of migration, no? When we say feminization of migration, we are not just talking about the number of women or Filipino women who are going abroad to work. What we are talking is the fact that not only are the number of women going abroad unprecedented compared to the past, but also because what is unprecedented is really the way in which women currently migrate independently of their families, no? So their families just join them later after they have already decided to migrate abroad. So that's one definition of feminization of migration. And also another definition of the feminization of migration is the fact that women dominate in certain job categories. So what are these job categories? No, these are the job categories that are often ascribed to women, such as caregiving, domestic work, and nursing. No, um, these jobs, no, what's wrong with these jobs? Uh, it has been studied and it has been argued that these type of job categories, because they are so-called feminized, are also undervalued, meaning to say uh, they are not given attention by governments in migrant receiving countries because no one wants to you know, their citizens no longer want to uh, apply for these types of jobs, and that when their citizens actually acquire these jobs, they do not. And the reason why they do not want to acquire these jobs is because they it's lowly paid, no. So the migrant receiving countries actually resorted to importing women migrants, um, such as nurses, domestic workers, and caregivers. So what I'm trying to say is that these types of jobs uh, have actually become the source of yung kaninang sinasabi ni Ma'am Oye na vulnerabilities, so, no, of women, because these jobs are undervalued, usually away from the radar of the government, specifically domestic workers and caregivers who work in home for the elderly. No? I'd like to show you a video.
Yimimi no sunu wailo yola to u tan down ni lo. La da khe bu yimu ko ni yimi ni lo. Yima hi dhamma do wa ba phuta le we bo ko yu ko bu ne apu kwi tsi khu ni ni lo. Phe yata o sitnya kha ye pa ti do do bu ya kla yimi do ko de ko ta lo ba ya le ye ba I thwe kwa thwe se yimu le ye do bu we asi te ta pha ni lo. Le ye to wo ye shi ka pa bo do bu we mu khi ya le ma ta le yu ko he ki do ye le po awe te khi ni lo. Pado tho to le pa kho pa la kla do le du su yu ko aser de ka ba ni lo. Le kle ta o to o pa to o ba thi ba si ko ni lo. Awe te phan nu ba le to le bu aga khi si ni lo. Phen ni kha ye ta de ni ba do ye so mo le ye ka ti ni lo. Phe pele du le bo ko do awe te le pa ba le bo ka da phu te de pha hi ni lo. Po kho te kho de pha ke he o ba kho ni lo. Khi to do bu te kho po mu de ga he ko ya ni lo. Ye ma da ma we hi hi ni.
Yes.
We will share the video from here. We will show the video from here. Paki-unmute, Miss Jean. We will show the video from Dawn, from here. Thank you. Saan na siya, Shane?
Yimimi no sunu wailo yola to u tan down ni lo. Yimimi no sunu wailo yola to u tan down ni lo. La da khe bu yimu ko ni yimi ni lo. Yima hi ama do wa ba phuta.
Ayusin mo na.
Hindi niyo makita? Okay na?
Yimimi no sunu wailo yola to u tan down ni lo. La da khe bu yimu ko ni yimi ni lo. Yima hi dhamma do wa ba phuta le we bo ko yu ko bu ne apu kwi tsi khu ni ni lo. Phe yata o sitnya
Ayaw? Try ko ulit.
Patry po ulit, Dr. Jean.
Ayaw
po lumabas ng video.
Try ko, gusto niya.
Sige po. Patry po. Salamat po.
Okay. Wait lang ha. I-ano ko na lang siya.
Yimimi no sunu wailo yola to u tan down ni lo. La da khe bu yimu ko ni yimi ni lo.
Yan, okay na?
Okay na po.
Yima hi မှာတော့ကွာဘဖူတာလဝေဘောကောယူကောဘူးနဲ့အပူကွေးတစီခုနေနေလောဖဲရတာကိုစီတနီယခါရပါတီတော့ဘူးရကလာယမီအဒုကတောကိုဒါလောပါရလေရပါဤထွဲကွာထွဲစရမိုးလေရတော့ဘူးရအစီတေတဖာနေနော်လေရတော့ရရှိကပါဘွားတော့ဘူးမူချီရလေမာဒါလေယူကောဟဲကီတော့ရလေပေါ်အဝဲတေခီနေနော်ပဒေါ်ထော်တိုလေပခောဘွာလာကလာတော့ပလေဒူစုယူကောအဆတ်တကပါနေနော်လက်ကလေဒါအော်တိုပတိုဘာတီဘာစီကောနေနော်အဝဲတေဖနူဘွာလာတိုလေဘူးအကခီစီနေနော်ဖဲနေကရတာတနေပါတော့ရေဆုံးမလေရေကတိနေနော်ဖဲပလေဒူလဘောကောတော့အဝဲတေလေပါဘွာလဘောကာတာဖိုးတေတပါဟီနေနော်ပိုခေါ်တေခိုတပါကဟဲအိုပခိုနေနော်ခီတော့တော့ဘူးတေခိုပုံတကဟဲကောရနေနော်ယမဒါလာဝဲဟီခီနေတော့ဘူးယထာထောပါတာခလပါတော့ယတအိုဝိပါနော့တော့ပါနေနော်ခီနေတော့ဘူးယထာထောပါတာခလနော့တော့ပါနေနော်ယဒိုနီမာလာလေတလားနေသစီရဒေါ်လာနေနော်ခီနေတော့ဘူးယစရနေယမိုးစေခုကရဒေါ်လာတော့ယဟထောလေခီတဖလဘူးနေနော်ခီနီဘွေတော်ဝေလောခီယဒိုနီမာတမအတော်လာလဲစရာဒူမာတော့ယအိုဘွီဘာတလားတဘလောနေနော်ခဲဤယမဘာတာတော့တေခိုဟီဖိုခေါ်ဖိုလအတာဂေဒူမာအခုယအိုဘွီဘာဘူနီတော့အိုဘွီနီကိုမီဒေစီကောနေနော်ယပဖူယစေတော့ယေဒိုဘွီဟောခိုယကကေအိုဘာလကောပေယောနီလောဘာတနောဆိုမူလယေဂေယကလိုလေအတာဂေဘဘာနီလောဒါခွေတယာမီအိုလယကဘာလေစုချီယာကောကဒီအမီယိုကိုအတော်တဘလောနီယတလေလူပါယဘာယိုတာလေတာတမှုအောဖဲယဟဲစုချီယာကောကနီလောယထာအုံမူပတစာအော်ဒီယာပါဖဲပလေတာစုထီလာကောကနေပပအိုတော့ဓာတူဓာတော့ဒေါ်ဓာဘူးဖလက်တော့ဘွားကိုကတဲ့သူတလေစုထီလာကောကဒီတော့ရတယ်တော့ဘွားကိုကတဲ့သူတလေစုထီလာကောကဒီတော့ရတယ်
So, ay, wait lang ha. Ano ko lang, what do you call this? Baka biglang, ayan, tapos na. As we've noted, wait lang. Papatayin ko lang.
I'm here today just to tell you a story, actually. But before I do, I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to just take a moment and think of somebody who you miss. Somebody who, for whatever reason, can't... No!
Sorry. Okay. Can you still see my slide?
Ano, ma'am? Wala pa po yung slide.
Sorry. Wait lang ha. Wait lang, hindi ko makita yung... Ayan, okay. Sorry. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes po.
Um, yeah. So why are why are women actually abroad? No, why are women migrating? It's not only because some are poor. It's not only because some would want to be liberated from traditions in their home countries. It's not because they want to be economically sufficient or economically independent. There are structural what do you call this, factors that have actually catalyzed women's migration abroad. And in this framework, or in this chart from UN Women, we will see why there has been great demand for female labor, no? And there are economic, structural changes, and social dimensions as to why women are actually abroad, no? And this has something to do with the conditions in developing countries called the global south, and rich countries called the global north. And the reasons actually in the global south would be about poverty, but not just poverty specifically, but inequalities, meaning to say, malaki ang agwat ng mayaman at mahirap, unemployment, most are in the informal sector, um, and that na-privatize din, ano? Na-privatize din yung what do you call this, services, because of neoliberal policies, meaning to say free trade agreements, opening of the markets, which have actually consequences in lowering the wages of specifically of women here in the Philippines, and also nagtipid, for instance, yung government in providing for social services, bumaba ang sweldo ng mga teachers, bumaba rin ang sweldo ng mga health workers. So yun yung nangyari sa economic restructuring, such that yung mga migrants, for instance, demanded to such that women workers also sort of were left out, no, in the development process. However, in the global north, the demand actually occurred because they also experienced the same type of economic restructuring. A lot of women have joined the labor force. Nagtipid din yung gobyerno, no? Before, it's the state that provides assistance to families with children, with the elderly. However, because of yung tinatawag na neoliberal development, opening of the markets, dapat ang Estado hindi masyadong lahat ng services pinoprovide. So yung sinasabi na crisis of the welfare state nangyari, no? So what happened was that ang care work was increasingly assumed by the family, by the private sphere. However, in wealthy countries, most women are actually working, such that nagkaroon ng crisis of the family reproductive model in these wealthy countries. Wala nang nag-aalaga ng matatanda, wala nang nag-aalaga ng mga bata, primarily because women go abroad, no? And that's why they had to demand for female labor. But this is not just the story, because some of you who are working, for instance, in the United Arab Emirates, in other Middle Eastern countries, may say that, bakit sa Middle Eastern countries bihira naman ng mga babaeng nag-work. There is also another way to look at it. In some countries where there are a lot of women who are not working, who are just in their homes, domestic work has become, for instance, a status symbol, such that if you have a domestic worker, specifically if you have a domestic worker from the Philippines, that then that is a way of telling your neighbors or um, your society that you have arrived. So that's one way to look at it. Why there are a lot of migrant women, domestic workers in the Middle East. In the case of Japan and Korea, for instance, you might be wondering, why is it that uh, Japan and Korea are aging societies, but it is only now that they have demanded sa Japan yung domestic worker, I think available na sa mga certain prefectures, primarily because yung modelo ng lipunan nila is such that they are, even if women are working, they are still needed to take care of their families, and they're not very familiar with having, or they're not very, their traditions are not very conducive to having, aside from the fact that in Japan, in cities, for instance, such as Tokyo, the houses are very small. They're not very familiar with having a domestic worker in the household, and that is also why some women resorted to another form of migration in these countries, and this is called marriage migration. No, so this in a nutshell. No, I'm sure some of this you already know from the work that you do, but this is just by way of telling you why are migrant women in demand, and why is it that work such as caregiving, nursing, and domestic work which are primarily regarded as women's work, are in demand. Nasabi ko na ito. Yeah, okay. So ito yung so we are now in the era that is called the feminization of migration. Okay? I'm going to skip na lang muna on the video. You can watch it na lang later siguro. So what is called gender-based violence, no? Gender-based violence is defined by the UN High Commissioner of Refugees as a violence that is directed against a person on the basis of gender or sex, no? And this is why I needed to tell you about the context, no, in which our domestic workers are in great demand, because it is where gender-based violence takes place, no, and this is why also they are in these parts of the world. No, violence that is directed against a person on the basis of gender or sex, as you have seen in the video. For instance, the domestic worker, the Burmese domestic worker, was trafficked, and she underwent a difficult situation such that it became, for instance, very difficult for her. And that is on account, for instance, of being a woman, no? And that is why she really went through a lot before having a good employer in Thailand, no? Okay. Okay. So what are forms of gender-based violence? I'm sure you have encountered this in the work that you do. No, one, of course, the most common would be sexual violence, such as, for instance, rape. Excuse me for a minute lang ho. Nag-earphone lang ako. Such as rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment, no? And why are these types of what you call this gender-based violence very common, no? Mainly because of the caregivers work not always in in caregiving homes that are public. Some perform caregiving work in houses that are not regulated by government. Others also, for instance, work inside houses. No, so this creates an environment which is conducive to rape, sexual harassment, and sexual assault by employers. In houses, for instance, where there are very few rooms, the domestic workers may also be sleeping beside some other members of the family, and such also uh, gives you an environment conducive to other forms of sexual violence. But gender-based violence can also be financial. What this means is that and why is this, for instance, once again related to gender? Well, because when you uh, look at financial what do you call this, when a salary is withheld, that usually happens among domestic workers, no? Why? Because again, the transactions happen inside households, and before the institution of yung tinatawag nilang, and that's why the Philippine government also instituted yung ATM, 'di ba? I'm not so sure how widely it is used, but this is again the type of work they are in, again, also makes it conducive for these kind of informal transactions to happen. No, i-delay yung salary, or i-withhold yung salary, or the salary that was promised will not be given. So this is again, I would consider a gender-based violence. The other is, for instance, uh, emotional. No, these are things that may have something to do. Emotional and mental violence would also be very much related. I'm sure this will be uh, presented to you in much more detail by a psychologist who will be giving you a talk. So this is something that is very much, again, um, performed by employers on account of their um, gender, no? Mainly because they would know that how to sort of push buttons that would probably make women cry, such as, for instance, we withhold your mobility, you cannot go home if, for instance, there's an emergency at home in the Philippines. You have not stayed here for 2 years under your contract. You need to go home, so they will bar that particular, for instance, domestic worker from going home. And so these results in, for instance, mental health breakdown among women, no? Sandali. May video na ba?
Wala pa po.
Wala? Ano ba yan? Okay.
On off na po ulit natin.
Ha? Oo nga, ano ko. Okay na?
Wala pa rin po eh.
Ay, nako. What about that?
Wala pa. Try niyo po i-on and off from your end.
Yun nga, ganun nga ginagawa ko eh.
Okay.
Meron na?
Wala pa po. Hintay-hintay lang na tayo ng konti. Pero mukhang wala pa po eh.
Meron
Wala
pa?
po.
Hindi kaya mahina ng battery. So I'll just use probably my video dito. Wait lang ha. Tatanggalin ko na yung I will just use my Ayan.
Okay na po, meron na po.
Okay. So yun.
Taas
So
lang ng konti yung video.
forms of gender-based violence would actually be sexual, financial, emotional, immobility, and mental, no?
Doc Jean, taas na ng konti lang yung video. Ayan. Thank you.
Okay. And
Konti-
just like what Ma'am Oyi said, no, this is something that is very much heightened during emergencies such as COVID. No, I'd like to share with you this video. I-screen share ko siya. Nakikita nyo na? Not yet.
Nakikita po pero walang sound.
Ha? Walang sound?
Wala po, Doc.
I-share niyo po yung computer sound niyo.
How do I do that?
May option po dun sa may
Kasi
taas.
naka-ano ako.
Okay na po. Thank you. I-start na lang ulit from the start yung video.
So, ayan, no? So, we've actually seen how migrants are actually coping or addressing, helping people around the world cope with the virus. But, and among the migrant women who are actually doing this are actually our Filipino nurses, no? Okay. So COVID-19 and migrants. No, I'd like to, do you see the slides? Or
Yes,
I-
nakikita po.
okay. Just like what Ma'am Oyi said a while ago, I'd like to give you an overview of some of the things, no, that have been happening to our migrants. Number one is access to healthcare due to status, no, and especially this is very much a case for people who are undocumented or because they have no health insurance. I think there are news reports that have actually presented this plight of our migrants. The next would be yung sinabi ni Ma'am Oyi kanina na language and cultural barriers which can prevent our women workers from understanding COVID-19 information and also from seeking help, no? The third would be racial discrimination. I think many of our nurses have experienced this primarily because in other parts of the world, the COVID-19 was initially called the Wuhan or the Chinese virus, which would tend to enhance discrimination against Asians, no? And also the lack of social protection if This is especially the case in countries where there are no bilateral agreements. The lack of social protection would make our migrants vulnerable. And why is this very important? Because most migrants who do not have social protection are women migrant workers, because again, they are in jobs that are thought of to be undervalued, no? And one very glaring and one very huge impact of COVID-19 would be, of course, job loss, no? And without social protection, this will be very much felt by our migrants, no? Especially women migrants. Exclusion in free testing and economic recovery plans, no? Of course, migrant receiving states would tend to only react and respond to the virus by way of taking care of their own. And it would be um, unfortunate for our migrants to be in these countries where they are not included, for instance, in free testing and also the economic recovery plans. No, once again, this would also um, indicate, for instance, uh, the value or the what you call this, um, the the tendency or the future, no, what I mean, what is the future of our migrants if they are not part of the economic recovery plans? Will they continue to be working in these parts of the world, or will they not? uh, will these jobs still be available? Our governments, because they're going to have their economies were severely affected, are they going to do away with some types of jobs that would require them to demand for foreign labor? So these are the questions that must also be taken care of or be addressed, of course, by POEA. Of course, problems on social distancing would be very difficult for domestic workers, caregivers, and health workers. And some are also uh, subjected to forced return, no? Especially because if they're for instance, employers also lost their jobs, so they will no longer have the money to employ their domestic workers, for instance, or caregivers. The other impact of COVID-19 on women workers would be the lack of PPEs, fatigue, and all sorts of occupational health issues, no, that they would probably experience during the time of pandemic. Lockdowns, as I've said earlier, if domestic workers in normal times would actually be lacking in mobility or would have limited mobility, then they would it would tend to be enhanced during lockdowns, and such that they are, of course, more prone to violence, no? And COVID-19 would really impact on migrant women. Why? Because they are dominant in the service sectors and essential services. No, so they are what you call this, exposed to the virus, and that would make them also be susceptible to uh, to sickness and illness. No, and of course unemployment. However, and this has been also reiterated by Ma'am Oy a while ago, that regardless of their migrant status, the rights of migrant workers must be protected during the pandemic. Meaning to say, whether they are undocumented, documented, or resident migrants, they must be protected. And this is actually institutionalized in international laws, some of which have already been mentioned by Ma'am Oy. But of course, you and I know that this is easier said than done, because at the end of the day, migrant receiving countries are powerful in their own territories. They have their own sets of rules. And even in the cases where we have bilateral agreements, they can easily what do you call this, forget about this in times of pandemic. And that is actually the role of our international human rights instruments to uh, um, so that frontline workers or our diplomats abroad can actually invoke this, um, just so that our migrant receiving countries can be reminded of their responsibility of the what do you call this, the international laws and treaties that they have signed, to which they have signed and to which they have committed. No, so this is the something that will be very useful for our Filipinos who work for our migrants abroad. One particular case study would be the case of Filipino nurses, no? I guess for them it's really double whammy, because initially they were prevented from leaving the country, and I would understand, Ata, that right now most are still prevented from leaving the country. There was just a cut-off uh, for those who already have their contracts until August 31. Majority of foreign nurses who died abroad are actually Filipinos, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom. And it is also unfortunate that, for instance, in the United Kingdom, migrant nurses are classified under a minority and ethnic nurses. I think our luckily associations of migrant nurses are actually uh, uh, lobbying the UK government, the National Health Service, to take account, no, to actually it's unfortunate because not taking into account as to how many Filipinos have died actually invisibilizes them, meaning to say they are invisible if they are just lumped under ethnic or migrant nurses, not necessarily based on their ethnicity. So this is something that we have to look into with the help of our migrant associations, specifically or specifically Filipino nurses associations, for instance, in the United Kingdom. Of course, they are what you call this, also experiencing discrimination, and being called frontliners, to my mind, is also double-edged, because when you say frontliners, they are it's actually used during wartime, and when you are in the front lines, you are prepared to die. But I don't think nurses signed up to die, and um, it's unfortunate because in most countries, the way I understand it, unlike here in the Philippines, nurses do a lot of work, uh, and they often stay longer in hospitals, specifically in the hospital beds of their patients compared to doctors, so they are more exposed to the virus. So yeah, rightfully they are called frontliners, but it's just unfortunate that when you say frontliners, parang ang ibig sabihin is that they should be prepared to die. So ang caveat niyan is that it's okay for them not to have enough PPEs, di ba? The other thing is the the discourse, or yung tinatawag na parating binabanggit na mapag-alaga talaga kaya in demand ang Filipino nurses, no, kasi quote unquote because of their caring nature. Of course we are happy with that, because this is something that uh, makes us very Filipino, yung ating pagiging Pilipino na-highlight, and we're proud of that. But on the one hand, this can be used against nurses, no? Kasi caring kayo, huwag niyong iwan yung pasyente niyo, or kasi caring kayo, sige, kahit off niyo na, magtrabaho kayo, or kahit wag kayong magreklamo kung wala kayong PPE or magkasakit kayo. You know, these are things that can actually enhance the occupational and safety hazards that are faced by Filipino nurses. Now, the reason why I just highlighted Filipino nurses is, I think, because they're really the ones who are, as I've said, quote unquote, in the front lines of the fight against COVID-19. So maybe this is something that we can discuss if we have time, no, from the line of work that you do. What are the challenges you face? No, I'm sure I have just probably scratched the surface. What are the challenges you faced in protecting the rights of women migrants in this pandemic, and what do you think can be done to overcome these challenges from the point of view, from the point of origin and destination countries? No, so I'm happy to hear your comments, suggestions, discussion
Ako na
point.
mag-ano na ako.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ay, ikaw na.
Yan. Thank you very much, Dr. Jean.
Mhm.
Video ko lang. Huh? Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation and with other videos also presented. We will have time for discussion, but before that, we would like to request everyone to put on their video. We'll have a group, a cloud shot. We will request everyone, please. Shane, can you please facilitate the cloud shot?
Okay po, pa-open na lang po yung camera po ng iba para po mapag-cloud shot po tayo. Salamat po.
Yung isang video, parang hindi
Yan. Sige.
Yan. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Isa pa po. Isa pa po. 1, 2, 3, smile. Last one po. 1, 2, 3, smile. And thank you po.
Kasama lahat, Shane?
Yes
Shane.
po.
Okay.
Apo.
Thank you very much. So before we go to our open forum, I'd like to introduce our facilitator for the open forum. And our facilitator for this afternoon is Lance Velasco. Lance has been a long-time volunteer and supporter of Dawn since 2007. He assists in developing programs for women migrant returnees and members of their families. He also assists SICHI, the Dawn's alternative livelihood program for women, and of course, the Dawn's multipurpose cooperative, where he is now a member of the board. Lance has been the coordinator of the Philippine Migrants' Rights Watch from 2007 to 2008, and from 2016 to the present. He develops programs for awareness of rights of OFWs, provide inputs for policy and legislations pertaining to the welfare of OFWs and members of their families. And he also is the editor of the PMRW publications. Lance is also the president for Luzon of the Parliament of Youth Leaders from 2013 to the present. He's also the director for Manila projects of the Philippine Australian Sports and Culture from 2019 to present. And Lance is an AB Political Science graduate at the University of Santo Tomas. So Lance, can you please start our open forum? Thank you.
Thank you again, Ma'am Mel, for that introduction. And thank you again to Ma'am Oyi and Doc Jean for your presentations about the rights of women and the status of our women migrants, especially now at this time of COVID. So unfortunately, Ma'am Oyi has to go on a urgent, equally important activity. So I think Doc Jean will be the one who will be answering your questions at this time. And can you share again the screen on the discussion points for the open forum? so that we can share it to all the participants if it's possible. So while they're doing that, we'll just give you a summary of what happened on what we discussed, especially on the feminization of migration. It has been a long time trend ever since. So we still had it during the time of nurses, then you had entertainers, and right now domestic workers. Then most of them are young adults, and and as we know, aside from the current situation and vulnerabilities that they are facing, they're also facing other issues, especially now at COVID. And then also discuss the different enabling situations or conditions on how to protect our migrants. So bilateral agreements, better laws, and of course, democratic CSO environment. And also protective measures are also to be provided during COVID. So to recap again, here are the discussion points on for the participants. Okay, hold on for a second. So based from the line of work that you do, what are the challenges you face in protecting the rights of women migrants in this pandemic? And what do you think can be done to overcome these challenges from the point of origin and destination countries? So I would be, yes, so the first muna, yung first point muna, then I would like to hear from you. So if you have any, just raise your hands. There's a raise hand option, or you may leave your notes on the chat button. Okay, so we have, let's see, from CMA, can we call on Ms. Che Gonzalez to share her points? Can we call Ms. Che?
Um, Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I did not raise my hand. I just um, chatted my comment or suggestion. So wait for a minute. All right. So my comment is service providers like us or the duty bearers. I know some of them are here with us. Must give value on the live experiences and or individual differences, as mentioned by the two speakers, when assessing the situation of a woman migrant worker and crafting the helping plan. So it's not really it's difficult to avoid to provide a generic helping plan. So my suggestion is we should always bear in mind to develop the helping plan together with the migrant worker to avoid an indirect or direct um, manner of disempowering them. And then I also said here that it is sad to know that gender and reintegration, an equally important cycle or aspect of migration, is being left out. That's why former women migrant workers will re-migrate because they continue to experience abuse in the family and community, like like financial or economic abuse. This situation is still very apparent, most especially in the time of COVID, due to the delayed response of the government. And giving some examples because I'm a caseworker. Example, the delayed release of Dolly ACAP, the one-time cash assistance of 10,000 pesos, and lack of a solid developmental perspective in programs and services for returning migrant workers. They came home empty-handed and their families are deep in debt because of the pandemic. This is certainly psychologically burdensome to them. That's why some of my clients or the distress OFWs that I have encountered, they would tell me that they want to go back again working abroad because they could not find any decent job here, and they need to pay their debts immediately. So yeah, so those are my new suggestions or comments for the discussion points. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Michelle. We would like to hear also from our representatives from DSWD and our welfare officers regarding their inputs regarding this topic. We would like to hear from you. So feel free to press the raise hand button, or you may just leave your message on chat so that we may acknowledge you. So maybe we would love to hear from you guys, so that we would like to know what from your end, what are the measures that you're providing for the welfare of our migrant workers in destination countries, especially those who are in DSWD, what are the interventions provided back home, and also those who are also overseas. So may we hear from anyone? So anyway, while we're waiting for others, let's look again at the discussion points. And I have another question. While they're still waiting, I have a question. Kasi, di ba, Doc Jean, we have measures that are provided for women, right? Because women are vulnerable. I'm not sure if this is off topic or what, but when it comes to because there's already the provision on SOGI, on on SOGI, right? What does the protection measure for women also count, or also covered trans women? Kasi trans women recognize themselves as women, and at the same time trans men naman, they were forward women. So are they also covered by these protective measures?
Oh. Your question is actually very important, no? And I must say that I'd like for it to be surfaced, uh, mainly because in these discussions, because I know most of our participants are practitioners, and I'm sure they have encountered dealing with trans women migrants in one way or another. And the literature, or the academic literature and policy literature on trans women and trans men migrants is still growing. I mean, very ano pa rin talaga, very, what do you call this, small pa lang yung literature. But of course, that does not mean that they are not there. It's just that, of course, they are still, I mean, just now, um, beginning to be felt, no, by governments, and they needed to be attended to. But I don't know, maybe let us ask our OWA welfare officers, what do they do with this, and what is the, what do you call this, um, what does the DOJ have to say about this? Because if I'm not mistaken, it's always the DOJ who decides kung sino yung mga beneficiary ng mga legislation that we pass. Ang problema ko kasi dito is, I'm not so sure if our laws are that inclusive, no? When they're referring to, halimbawa, women migrant workers.
Yeah,
If you know
so
what I mean.
so yun nga rin it's an issue kasi nga 'di ba, if and another topic, for example nga, there's this issue nga, if trans women are nakakapasok sa beauty pageants on the basis that they're already considered women, does that mean also in these types of protective measures for migrant women workers, they're also considered? So that's quite a parang ano siya interesting topic to discuss rin in one way or another, knowing that there's already although there's a certain percentage, we also have to protect them in one way or another. So we don't know how are we going to protect them. So it's best that if we can hear from some of our representatives from OWA or the SWD regarding this matter. You may raise your hand or leave the message on the chat box. Or you may also raise other issues as well, like we were discussing a while ago, on what are the measures you've been doing to protect our women migrants from your end. Let's see. Okay. One. I think they're still synthesizing their comments.
Pero you have a very valid question kasi for instance, I just came from a public hearing yesterday in a Zoom public hearing about women politicians in political parties, giving incentives to political parties who field women as candidates at kasama na dun sa definition nila ng women yung trans women. So it's something that's already in the proposed measure, but and this is the reason why I would also like to ask our people on the ground, yung mga welfare officers, if they have encountered this and if they have somehow been in a dilemma, for instance, dealing with trans women and as to whether these trans women are in fact covered, and if covered, what reason was given?
Yes. So, can we hear from some of the participants? I think, baka nahirapan kayo mag-chat or we've invited people to leave their mics on just in case so that you feel free to talk just in case. Just recognize, just say your names, then you can share to the group.
Kasi when we say feminization of migration, although I referred to the number of women who are migrant women, when we say feminization of migration, we're not just also we're also describing the work that is ascribed to women. So that does not mean that also means that there are trans women who can be occupying jobs such as domestic worker or nurses or caregiving jobs.
So I think there's one na naka-unmute. Can we hear from you po, Miss Gemma? Hello?
Hi.
So the rest po, just feel free to share your concerns or comments so that we can hear from you. Kasi this is very interesting eh. And I also have another issue to discuss then. Di ba, the recent news? May recent news po tayo, di ba, yung may in-abuse na yung sa Brazil. So,
yeah.
Yun yung isa pang issue ngayon eh. So, is it easy, paano naapektuhan ba nung issue na yun yung pagre-report ng mga women dun sa mga diplomatic posts? Kasi nga now that meron ngang case of abuse.
Si Gemma muna na ganun.
Okay, Ms. Gemma, do you have any comments po?
Hi, good morning. So far, here in Greece, wala naman po kaming na-encounter na problem regarding
yung challenges niya.
Maybe in some other areas like
for example, what are the other challenges, ma'am?
Maybe please wait for a while. I'm not prepared.
No,
We have here because dito po sa Greece, karamihan po dito domestic workers. So yung maybe some are deprived dun sa mga information from the Philippine government or from the Philippine
meron ding Germany.
Kasi po karamihan yung mga domestic worker were not allowed to go out from the house hindi po sila inaalaw ng kanilang employer, maybe because for fear dun sa ano po sa COVID. So ang nangyayari po, yung mga information na binibigay ng ating halimbawa ng polo, hindi po nila alam. Especially, one example po yung sa COVID, yung AKAP assistance. So ang nangyayari po, medyo na-delay sila dun sa application, saka dun sa yung kaalaman na mayroon palang binibigay na COVID assistance para doon sa mga affected na domestic workers. So another challenge, sorry po, hindi po ako prepared doon sa pagbigay ng comment. Pero po, siguro, yung iba pang challenges, yung ibang domestic workers na infected ng COVID, ayaw po nilang lumantad. So, although alam naman natin ang OWA, mayroon pong assistance na financial assistance para doon sa mga COVID infected as long as makapag-submit sila ng medical certificate or katunayan, any proof na sila po ay infected. Kaya lang yung iba po ayaw nilang ipaalam na sila po ay naging COVID-19 infected. So ang isa pa pong challenge siguro dito, yung doon sa AKAP, yung mga iba pong mga nag-a-avail, ay dito po kasi pala, meron po kasing different types of permits. Meron po yung employment, meron po yung permanent, meron yung mga long term, ganun po. So ang permit nila ay employment, automatic sila po ay qualified doon sa AKAP. Pero po yung mga permanent, ang kanilang permit, hinihingian po namin sila ng any proof na sila po ay mayroong employment. Kasi subject din po tayo sa COA audit. So yun po yung isang challenge. Kasi po yung karamihan dun sa mga 10 years, saka mga permanent, mga part-timer lang sila at hindi po sila makapag-submit ng any proof na mayroon po sila ng employment. So yun po ang ginagawa na po namin, ini-email namin sila or tinitext na mag-submit sila ng requirements. So yun yung mga challenges dito sa GRIS. Thank you.
Thank you po ma'am for sharing your comments and challenges. Meron po dito si Miss Pinarok, yung meron siyang comment. Is it okay if you can share from us your points po ma'am? Yan po, I'll open the mic just in case po you want to share something po ma'am.
Sige po. Tama ba? For us po kasi po sa region, especially as the focal person for overseas Filipinos, talagang hirap po din kami sa office in catering for this distressed returning overseas Filipinos. Especially in connecting nga po doon sa mga programs. Kasi nga po, alam natin na talagang walang-wala silang bumalik. And then specifically pa yung itong pandemic na yung sa swab test, who's going to take charge of the swab test, who's going to take the accommodations. Although we had meetings also with the task force, however, there's still need na talagang magkaroon talaga ng funds for this returning OFs. Kasi kahit i-refer namin sa local government units, sila rin, aming first response kasi talaga is yung aid assistance to individuals in crisis situation. So it's either for food assistance, this is only a maximum of 3,000 pesos, and then yung for transportation din po, maximum din po yung sa 3,000. Depende po kung saan po uuwi yung returning OF. So, medyo yun, hirap kami talaga ngayon sa funds. Kaya nga, kami sa field office, we are requesting also our counterparts central office na mag-augment o mag-provide ng additional funds sana for this returning overseas Philippines. Yung dumadaming ngayon, lalo especially mostly ng referrals ngayon is from NAIA o one-stop shop. And then sa referral network naman po, meron naman po kaming referral pathway, kaya lang po, our role specifically for Region 3 before was only to convene yung mga agencies. Yeah, kailangan ho namin talaga merong mag-lead na yung mag-orchestrate ba dahil sa local sa local natin sa national it's OWA who's mandated na ano. So sa DSWD now we have the establishment of the social welfare attaché, kaya meron po kami 7 social welfare attachés in abroad po. So sa LGUs ang hinahanap naman nila sa amin, magkaroon sana kami din ng guidelines. So we introduced already yung aming MC, parang MC5 o basta ang MC for parang sa program din ng assistance to individuals in crisis, kasi nga wala nakalagay na specifically doon for overseas Filipinos. Ang nakalagay sa amin kasi talaga is families, although lahat naman kinikater ng department as well as the local government unit. Kaya lang yun nga, there has to be something like a guideline na talagang they can adapt sa local government para magkaroon ng funds din. Although there are some other LGUs na nag-initiate din na magkaroon ng funds for these returning OFs, like the province of Cagayan, Pampanga, na ngayon yung project po nila na yung hatid sundo sa mga overseas na Kapampangan. But for other provinces, naghahanap pa po kami. Yun po yun. And then ngayon nga, hindi pa po kami masyado, nag-establish pa rin po kami sa one-stop shop sa Clark. Kaya lang ho, maraming dinidemand sa amin. This is already privatized yung Clark. So nahirapan din po kami. We are arranging for some admin costs para for us. Like PPEs, wala naman ho kami PPEs, and how to attend for this returning OS. Yun po, for Region 3 po.
Thank you po for
so we are lobbying. Nagkaroon na rin po ng sa NEDA po, yun hong sa stand po na magkaroon na po ng regional subcommittee for migration and development. Hopefully nga po ma-approve na po yun para at least talagang mag-meet na po lahat ng involved po sa overseas Filipinos po. Yun po, thank you.
Thank you po from Ms. DSWD. I have may nag-raise ang hand from Singapore. May we call our representative from Singapore po to share her thoughts. So, ma'am. Yes. Hello, ma'am.
Hello po.
Yes.
Magandang hapon po sa inyo. Director Mel, good afternoon po. Si Sarah po ako dito sa Singapore. Okay, para ma-share ko lang din po yung aming mga pinagdadaanan dito sa Singapore ngayong pandemya.
Apa, sige po.
Opo. Yes po. Ngayon po kasi yung talagang very challenging na pinagdadaanan namin dito sa Singapore na hindi rin po namin talaga maintindihan. Nakasabay ng crisis na pandemic na ito. Kung ano-anong klaseng sumulpot na sakit din sa mga kababayan natin. Talagang napaka-prone ng ating yung sa mga helper, yung sa mga FDWs po natin. Na minsan hindi mo iisipin, sakit pala yun. Kagaya po ngayon, yung very challenging po sa amin. Meron po kaming ilan na comatose na mga nasa hospital. Yung mga employer po nila ay gusto na silang i-send home dahil siguro nahirapan din sila sa hospital bills. So ngayon, yung problema po na mga taga Iloilo po sila. So parang wala pa pong direct flights na ngayon sa Iloilo. Ang problema din po sa Iloilo is walang yung airlifter So parang mahihirapan yung proseso na mapauwi sila. And yung pagpapauwi po ng mga medical cases, napakaraming channels. Papa-approve sa DOH, yung mga medicals, papa-approve ng exemption na mag-quarantine. Yun po, and siyempre number one, yun din pong sa financial. Yung mga helper na minsan iniintindi rin nila yung bills nila. Although yun nga po, dito naman sa Singapore, cover naman sila ng insurances, and yung sagot din naman po ng employer yung gastusin na yon. Pero yung po yung parang minsan pinagdadaanan namin na ang hirap isipin na nagtatrabaho sila ng ilang taon, tapos nung nagkasakit na gusto na nila pauwiin. So parang yun po yung inaano namin, paano natin dun yung mapoprotektahan talaga yung kababayan po natin. So ayun po yung medyo challenge dito rin sa amin sa Singapore. And may guidance din naman po ang atin siyempre yung polo. Kasi po dito sa Singapore medyo ilang pirasong manpower kami dito pagdating sa welfare cases. Yan din po yun kasi hindi pa nakakapagpadala din ng officer para dito sa Singapore.
Thank you po.
Yes.
Ilan na po ang mga Pilipino na OFW sa Singapore?
Pumapalo sa 180,000 to 200,000.
200,000. Tapos ilan po yung employees na nag-handle ng welfare programs nila from your end? Ilan po kayo dyan?
Dalawa po kami. Dalawa.
Ayun talaga, very challenging. Opo. So,
ako po yung natirang organic dito. Tapos yung local hire, nandyan din po siya sa webinar natin. Nag-join po kaming dalawa. So para yun po. Kaming dalawa dito sa Singapore.
Opo, talagang kayo. Malaking ang hirap ng inyong task. So sobrang dami ng
Yes po. So magmula po nung pumutok talaga yung pandemya ng Marso, nagkataon naman na umuwi na ang welfare officer. Isa po akong staff dito, yung admin staff niya, tapos yung local hire. Talaga naman pukbukan. So minsan, ako lang na lumuha kami ng dugo.
Opo. Sandali lang po. Si Miss Lucci po, may tanong rin po. Tinatanong daw po ni Miss Lucci, saan sa Iloilo po yung mga OFWs po na nagre-request sa Iloilo? Saan part ng Iloilo daw? Do you have any idea?
Sige po. Yung isa sa Sara, yung isa sa Guimaras.
Oo.
Yes,
so yun yung mga... Tapos ma'am, meron kasing natandaan ko noon, yung regarding sa medical repatriation. Kasi uma-attend kami minsan ng mga meetings as part of the Migrant Health Network. Ang isa sa programs ngayon ng DOH, yung IMRAP. Familiar po ba kayo sa IMRAP?
IMRAP?
Yung IMRAP, yung Medical Repatriation Assistance Package po nila. Meron silang, kumbaga, yung interagency yun interagency effort para lahat ng medical repatriation na ko-coordinate ng maayos. Usually, DOH yung nasa helm nun. Kumbaga, ginagawa, nire-refer ng, kasama din yung DOLE sa DFA. Yes. Opo. So, usually, ang ginagawa nun, nire-refer ng mga cases sa DOH, tapos yung DOH yung mag-facilitate kung paano i-repatriate yung mga nagre-request ng ganong assistance.
Yes po.
But I'm not sure if it's being implemented.
Yes. Sa ngayon po naman, hindi pa kami nakaka-experience yung talagang medical evacuation, yung talagang naka-air ambulance kasi super mahal talaga. Na kumbaga parang minsan iniisip siguro ng mga employer na ito na yung helper ko, ibabiyahe ko pa uwi ng Pilipinas halos millions na po yung magagastos. So ngayon, ang nagagawa ng employer ay yung mabigyan lang din ng parang nursing aid o yung medical escort. Hanggang doon talagang napipiga po namin na magkaroon ng medical escort yung mga helper, yung mga OFW po natin hanggang Pilipinas or hanggang probinsya.
Ako na lang. Pero na-discussion na po ba sa DFA yung tungkol dun sa matter na yon, yung repatriation? Kasi usually, kapag ganong mga matters, pwedeng i-course through sa DFA, tapos i-discussion sa DOH para sila mag-ayos. Kasi baka yun yung issue kasi, kaya ayaw nila kasi issue-shoulder ng employer. Pero alam ko may program naman sa interagency na may mga funds na allotted for such instances. So I think that would be best na you coordinate with the DFA or siguro para ma-coordinate with the DOH from here.
Lance, may tanong lang ako kay Sarah. Yung sakit ng comatose, hindi COVID?
Ay, hindi. Hindi po, ma'am. Yes po, hindi po.
Ang naiisip ko lang kasi dito sa nangyayari, di ba? Yung the Philippine government takes pride in the fact that we are considered yung model in migration management, no? Parating pag may sakuna abroad, pag may gera, may conflicts, ready yung mga ating yung OWA at saka mga sa DFA, labor at saka yung mga attaches natin, consuls to respond. Kaya lang, what's unique about this crisis is that yung attention ng Philippine government at saka syempre nandun sa pandemic din to contain the pandemic dito sa loob ng bansa. Tapos yung mobility pa, transportation, so unique. In fairness, hindi naman talaga, hindi pa to nangyari before. So kahit nasabihin mong modelo tayo, talagang merong hindi mapapakita.
Maka-ano na siya eh. Low. Ay, nandun ako.
So tama, very challenging. Sinabi nga po na meron po nga comment dito na kapag mga ganong medical repatriation, you have to course through with the DFA, tapos i-discussion with the OMWA and DOH para sila yung mag-facilitate ng ganong services. So any other challenges or na gusto i-share? Ma'am, anyone? You feel free to share, just talk. Or raise your hands. Ito yun, si Ms. Hart. Yes,
Hello.
Ms. Hart.
Yes, good afternoon everyone po sa Philippines and good morning, good evening po sa ibang panig po ng mundo. Pasensya na po kayo, I'm currently on our sasakyan going to the office. Actually, i-share ko lang po yung dito sa
Saan
Spain.
po kayo, ma'am?
Sa Spain, sir. Apo. Spain po. So, currently, nasa almost 1.5 million na po ang COVID cases natin dito. And we have 41,000 plus na death cases po. Sa mga Pinoys naman po natin dito, marami na rin po yung ating mga namomonitor na COVID cases, no? So yung mga challenges mo, it started po nung ating first lockdown na talagang national lockdown siya. Andun po yung napakahirap talaga na situation na syempre walang mobility. So paano ka magsiserve sa ating mga migrant workers? So more on telephone calls, more on emails. So very challenging talaga kasi nandoon yung panahon na maraming umiiyak na OFWs because wala silang pagkain, maraming mga cases na nagkasakit sila and they don't know what to do. So andun po yung natin, yung service ng OWA, ang service ng Philippine Embassy, tulong-tulong po sa pagbigay po ng information, sa pagbigay ng guidance sa ating mga overseas Filipino workers. So with yung kanina po mga na-discuss, yung mga about sa trans women, so far naman po wala kaming na-encounter na case na ganon. Ang siguro yung sa nurses lang po natin, there are few nurses po dito na na-hire po ng isang hospital. So nag-serve sila during the COVID, yung medyo peak po ang ating COVID cases po dito. And ang naging problema nila dito is yung sa language barrier. And some of the applicants din po, yung mga nag-apply, nung nag-advertise sila or nagtanong sila kung sino yung mga gustong mag-volunteer for the work po sa hospital. Ang nagiging problema nila is wala sila talagang exposure sa medical field dito kasi karamihan nga dito ay mga domestic workers. So yun, isa yun sa mga challenge sa kanila aside from the language barrier. Pero when it comes naman po sa provision ng mga like sa food provision, yung mga ating welfare assistance po sa kanila, nakaka-provide naman po dito, although restricted nga ang mobility. Through mga webinars po natin, nagkakaroon tayo ng mga information dissemination kung ano yung mga pwedeng assistance po na maitulong po ng Philippine Embassy dito at ng Polo po at OWA. So basically, hindi naman po ganun karami ang welfare cases. Yung sa regular days natin noon before the COVID, may few cases lang po tayong na-encounter na yung nagreklamo ng mga migrant women against their employers na merong konting maltreatment, pero only a few po. And sa ibang bansa, since hawak din po namin ng France, Portugal, Monaco, and Andorra, sa France po naka-encounter kami ng case na kung saan ay diplomat po ang involved. Pero basically natulungan naman po siya ng Philippine Embassy at po ng Polo Madrid. Sa case naman po ng yung mga medical cases, karamihan nga dito sa ngayon, syempre, COVID crisis tayo. So maraming Filipinos na rin ang na-monitor na may COVID case, may ilang death cases po tayo ng Pinoys, may ilang na ICU. Pero basically sa ngayon po, medyo nag-subside na yung cases. Ilang portion na lang po yung naka-isolate po. And basically, yun lang naman po yung mga challenges. Ang mahirap lang po dahil kulang po tayo sa manpower, so hindi natin mabigay lahat yung services na pwede pang maibigay. That's all po for Spain. Thank you.
Si Ma'am Mel, may tanong daw po.
Tanong ko lang,
Yes,
ma'am, dyan po sa Spain, ilan po yung mga Filipinos natin dyan at yung mga women?
Basically, kung 40 plus to 70,000 po, mga nasa 60 to 70% po ang women, ma'am.
Ilang percent po?
60 to 70% po.
Ang women.
Tapos, karamihan po women and more, yes.
Karamihan po ng women natin, anong work nila? Domestic worker?
Domestic po, opo. Tsaka service industry, ma'am.
Sige. Thank you. Balikan ko lang yung kay Miss Sara kanina. Kasi ang Philippine Migrants Rights Watch, member ng Philippine Migrant Health Network. Yung network na yon is being led by DOH. Chair yung DOH and the Philippine Migrants Rights is the vice chair. Oo. Itong network na to ang nag-facilitate ng formation ng IMRAP.
Okay.
Yes.
Sige po, ma'am.
Hello. Nandito pa po ako. Anyway, narinig po ako. We have some technical difficulties at the moment. While at the meantime, Miss Sarah, is it okay na mag-send kayo ng message sa amin? Sa PMRW or kay Mamel to discuss the details tungkol dito sa mga women so that mapa-follow up po namin. So anyway, tanong ko yung may request yung iba. I think the others might have some comments din. Yung tandaan ko yung sa Spain, meron kayong kinwento tungkol sa welfare case. Ano ba yung meron sa France ba yon?
Yung diplomat.
Yung affecting diplomat?
Opo. Actually, yes, medyo misunderstanding siguro. It's parang, pwede ko ba sabihin?
Hindi naman. Like,
No,
ano lang siya?
ano lang po.
It involved,
Yeah, opo. Pero naman siya, naayos naman po siya. Nagawan po ng, actually, communication lang with the Philippine Embassy through our help po.
Oo, kasi yung concern ngayon, di ba, may news ngayon,
Yes,
yung sa Brazil, di ba?
Yes.
So kasi, ang issue rin ngayon, kasi baka dahil sa nangyayari na yon, hindi ba yun naka-affect dun sa mga gusto magpumunta sa mga embassies na magsumbong? Kasi baka natatakot rin yung mga migrants na magsumbong kasi yung mismong diplomat, mayroong mga ganong history.
Po. Yeah, may ganung notion po. Pero so far naman dito, sir, sa Spain or sa France, yun pa lang naman yung na-encounter namin. And hindi naman ganun kagrabe yung situation.
Opo.
Mhm.
About
Mhm.
yung
Pero,
other, oo, yes, ma'am.
yes po. We're informing naman po the workers here na anything po, any problem that they may encounter sa kanilang workplace po, open po lagi ang POLO, ang Philippine Embassy po sa mga ganun pong complaints.
Oho, thank you. Kasi
Yeah.
yun yung concern rin sa mga ibang, yun isang issue ngayon na we are
Yes.
here to protect our migrants. Tapos kung may mga ganong instances, baka magdadalawang isip yung mga migrant workers lumapit, which is also gonna be causing more issues, di ba? So yun yung iniiwasan natin. We are at the forefront of protecting them. Tapos kung may lalabas na ganong issue. So yun. So how about the others? Meron ba silang mga comments? Parang nakita ko kanina si Owa Berlin. Would you like to share something po?
Yes. Good morning po. This is Welfare Officer Sylvia Gabriel from Berlin. Ang challenges ho namin dito sa Berlin, dahil we cover yung mga other posts like Russia, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So, ang ano ho namin dito, ang ini-invoke namin dito is yung social protection. So, as part of our mandate sana is to go to our areas, but given the pandemic, so we set an alternative so conduct of mga webinars po. So doon sa ating presentation kanina, yung paano natin maipaabot ano yung mga serbisyo. So with this, doon sa ating mga nurses, lalo na mga frontliner, so we are collaborating with the government para sa pagkandak ho na aming mga integration. Dahil ho doon sa Manila, the OWA has conducted yung mga PEDOS pero hindi pa ho sapat. So kailangan natin ho ma-enhance yung mga maiparating yung mga services na ginagawa po ng POLO. So para maipaabot po natin, lalo na ho yung mga culture, ano yung mga rights and protocols na ating mga nurses. So yun po. And then dun sa ating, sa Germany po, ang ano ho namin dito, ang mga challenges ay dahil yung mga nurses, being the frontliner, umaabot ho kami dun sa mga na-COVID po na mga about 92. So composed dito po yung mga nurses, although maganda naman ho ang kanyang service sa hospital. So we encountered yung mga 100% recovery. In also dun sa ating mga naapektuhan din, yung mga seaman din po ay kasama din po dun sa mga na-servicean namin na para ma-monitor yung mga kanilang cases of COVID. Dito ho sa ano na ito, ang aming challenges po ay kung paano, sa ngayon po mayroon kaming active na mga 10 ho active, although we are still waiting po yung ating pondo from the OWA dahil nagkaroon po ng bagong MOI about the funding sources. So yun po. Tapos dito sa aming mga affected na mga COVID, we are also have good network with our PhilCom dahil sila po yung nagpapa-inform sa amin about kung sino yung mga naapektuhan ng mga nag-COVID. And also, we also coordinate with the PRA, yung Philippine Recruitment Agency, dahil may mandato po na ang mga agency ay i-monitor po nila yung kanilang mga worker. So dito ho meron kaming collaboration para mag-coordinate into check their health condition daily. Opo. And then ano po sa aming mga services with other jurisdictions, ang challenges ho namin na encounter po ay yung sa AKAP. So dun ho sa mga affected dito sa country, lalo karamihan po sa Russia is mga women talaga, yung mga galing ng Asia, nakaramihan po yung mga irregular. So kung paano ho namin ma-monitor ito mga ito dahil itong mga karamihan po sa Russia na nag-avail ng AKAP ay hindi po mga OWA member. So as requirement naman po sa financial assistance, paano mo siya mami-member being the requirement po. So inano ho namin, invoke namin yung social protection. So with this, nagampanan naman po namin ang aming mga services sa AKAP, kaya lang po ang naging problema until now ay kung paano maire-remit yung mga kanilang financial assistance with the help ng ating Moscow Philippine Embassy. So nag-coordinate na lang po kami para maiparating ho yung pondo doon with the authorization from the head office for them to disburse itong mga pondo ho ito na. Pero until now po, ang dami hong bumabalik dahil ang ginamit ng mga worker ay ibang account ng kaibigan. So ang dami pong pumapasok sa mga chat namin kung ang tagal na nung aming mga nagrereklamo na sila, nagmamakaawa. But how we can cope with those problems, mali naman po yung mga account nila, mga nagsarado na. So until now, we are still checking how we can improve the disbursement of their respective financial assistance po. And also with this, dahil po doon sa dapat ho sana mapuntahan namin itong mga area because dahil naman sa pandemic, ito na nga po pinagpapatuloy namin yung paggandak ng mga webinar, ano yung mga services ng Polo, ano yung mga ibang programa, yung mga conduct na mga reintegration, mga ganun po. So iba-iba pong mga plano namin, mga pagkakandak nito, mga naiiba pong mga serbisyo ng ating Polo. So, yun po ang aming mga challenges right now. Yeah.
Ma'am, tanong ko lang po.
Opo.
Tinry niyo po yung remittance centers dun sa pagbibigay ng pera. Kasi dito sa atin, ganun ang ginagawa ngayon. No? Kasi
sa
kung...
ano po?
Sa overseas, di ba, may remittance centers din po. Kunyari, Western Union, mga iba pang ganyan.
Opo, ma'am. Na-try na po lahat, ma'am.
Wala, hindi nila ma-receive.
Hindi, kasi iba ho ng Russia ho parang meron silang parang iba ho ang account sa Russia ngayon.
Wala.
Oo. Kahit na tama yung account pero hindi maano nung embassy ano ba talaga ang problema? Tama naman yung account. So nagko-coordinate po yung embassy.
Pero nako-contact niyo naman po yung mga kababayan natin by phone or by messenger ganon.
May mga emails po kami. Although approved na nga po yung iba kaya lang hindi na sila nagre-reply. So paano namin kumbaga nag-set na kami ng date kung talagang wala. Medyo ini-archive muna namin.
At least na-try po yung iba't ibang ways ano.
Opo, with the assistance ho ng ating Moscow kasi sila na mismo talaga ho Dahil from Berlin to Moscow, umaabot kami ng 35 euro ang transaction, tapos bumabalik, i-remit na naman ulit namin. So incurred mga yung huge amount of bank charges.
Mahal nga po yun. Oo, yun nga. Buti nga in-open up niyo yung issue na hinahandle niyo sa may Russia.
Yes,
kasi nga, yun yung issue yung marami doon na mga irregular.
Yes,
kasi, paano mo tutulungan kung irregular? Kasi iba doon, di ba?
Ito po ngayon Dahil po, sir, yun sa in-invoke namin yung social protection, so karamihan talaga doon is irregular. But with the help ng ating home office, na nag-recommend po kami na mapa-member, yung mga, lalong-lalo yung mga bago, may guidelines po kasi na pagka first time, hindi pwedeng mag-member. It needs the personal appearance. But we requested and proposed to OWA na bigyan po ng approval. So, nagpapasalamat po kami at nai-grant naman po ang aming request. That's why we yung mga, na-enroll ho namin yung mga bagong members po sa OWA for them to ma-avail po naman po itong mga financial assistance.
Ask ko lang, Lance, yung 35 euros, yun yung, di ba $100 yung akap? $100?
200 po.
200.
Kasi kung paulit-ulit ka, di ba, baka mas more than $200 pa yung...
Yes, yun nga po Kaya nga po, bawat worker, bawat remittance, kung ilan na lang yun. Kasi itong mga, nung nung una, kina-charge pa sa aming fund Kaya lang nung kumbaga, sila yung mali na, nagkaroon kami ng notice na kung hindi kayo maingat, matcha-charge sa inyo itong mga yung mga bank charges. Yung gano'n. So halos wala na matitira pag gano'n. That's why we propose na i-transfer yung pera sa embassy para sila na ho yung mag-disburse. Pero sa Berlin pa rin yung processing. So yun po. Ito, hanggang ngayon po yun ang aming pinag-iisipan with the embassy. Kahapon lang po yung meeting namin kung paano namin mapapacilitate ho itong mga naiiwanan na pabalik-balik pong mga financial claim. At ang dami na po sa aming hotline na talagang ilang buwan na po na nagrereklamo, pero yun po yung mga dahilan, yung kanilang mga bank account at yung ruling ng bangko mismo ng Russia.
Okay po.
Pero mag-i-issue po na advisory po para ano sa embassy website.
Okay po. Si Miss Lucci po nag-raise kaninang hands eh. So we'll have to call her. Miss Lucci.
Hello po, good afternoon. Si Lucci po ng DSWD FO6 dito sa Iloilo. Kaya nagtanong ako doon kay Miss Sarah kung saan sa Iloilo. Doon sa may OFW. So actually dito sa DSWD FO6, maraming mga returning OFs, dagsa-dagsa yung mga ano natin, yung mga OFW. So si DSWDs, kinokontak namin sila for psychosocial counseling. And then pag nalaman namin din na may kailangan sila, nagbibigay kami ng medical assistance, educational at saka cash assistance. So case to case basis 'yon. Ang problem ngayon is yung challenges pala is halimbawa yung mga OFW na mga undocumented. So usually, 'di ba, pag undocumented sila, direct visa, direct hire. So yung visa is tourist. So yun ang dami ngayon sa amin, yung mga undocumented na mga maltreatment, physically abuse. So kasi siguro doon sa basic sa share nila, may isang teacher doon na nagsabi na siguro hindi sila aware yung mga rights nila pagdating doon kasi hindi sila nagpedos at saka dumaan sa OWA. Yun siguro din yung isang challenge doon na paano natin yung mga undocumented, paano natin sila na matulungan din sila kahit papaano kung yung mga rights nila doon sa ibang bansa. Kasi nga hindi nga sila nagpedos, kahit na culture ng pupuntahan nila, hindi nila alam kung ano yung mga culture. Yun ang challenge doon sa mga ano. Pero dito sa amin nagbibigay kami ng assistance. Kaya lang is limited kasi nga yung sa budget. Yun din ang sabi ni Ms. Penaruk. And then pwede din namin based sa assessment din, nire-refer namin sila sa LGU for possible livelihood assistance po. Yun lang po.
Lance, siguro may ano lang ako doon sa nabanggit, no? Yung limited ang budget, naghihintay sa DSWD. Kasi may Senate hearing ngayon tungkol sa budget. And during the hearing, it was found out na 80-something billions ang available funds pa ng DSWD. Hanggang December na lang yun, di ba? Oo. Yung bang budget na sinasabi nyo po?
Baka sa may X siguro yun.
Po?
Baka sa may assistance to individual in crisis po?
Basta po yung budget pa ng DSWD para sa assistance sa ating mga Pilipinos ay malaki pa. 80 billion plus. Kaya tinatanong po nung sa dami ng nangangailangan ngayon, lalo na yung SAP and all, bakit hindi nare-release? Diba? So baka pwede nyo rin pong i-follow up. Bakit matagal yung release ng mga funding nyo? Kasi marami tayong kababayan na nangangailangan, di po ba? Mahirap pag nasa ground ka, di ba? Ikaw ang pinupuntahan ng tao, o ikaw ang tinatawagan, at saka tayo po yung nakakakita doon sa kalagayan ng ating mga mamamayan at mga kababayan, di po ba?
Yes,
so,
ma'am. Actually, siguro, ma'am, yung sinasabing mo yung yung sa budget na yun, baka sa yun, ma'am, sa assistance to individual in crisis situation. So pinundin natin na baka sa yun, sa kung baka kabuuan. Kasi
sa kabuuan nga po yun ng DSWD.
Yes, ma'am. Kasi sa ma'am, yung OFW mismo.
Hindi ang OFW kasama din naman po sa DSWD, di ba? Lahat ng undocumented, DSWD ang in charge, di po ba?
Yes, ma'am. Tama yun. Yun ang doon. So pero kami naman nagbibigay kami ng assistance sa kanila. And then
Sige
yung
po.
livelihood, kung pasok sila doon. So, ma'am.
Sige, Lance, next.
May I call on si Paul? Paul might have any comments po.
Bumalik ba?
Yes, nandiyan po siya.
Yeah, I'm back. No, I got disconnected. Thank you so much, Lance. Let me just take this opportunity to air out concerns po namin kasi I have a private Facebook group of OFWs. Majority of them are women as well, both sea-based and land-based. And tama yung sinabi ni Shea about the CMA. The major concern of everyone right now who are displaced and repatriated would be the ACAP. Kasi there are people who are waiting for months on end. And some of them are 8 to 7 months pushing na ganun katagal na nag-iintay sa ACAP. And we would just like to know as well, because my group has become a mediator between the government and those people who we are helping. My group consists of mga 13,000 members na po. It's diverse. Globally, meron na rin po kami mga members na nagpapatulong sa amin. Iba-iba po mga concerns nila. Some of them are great, some of them are financial based, pero you can feel the distress na po ng mga tao. Kasi I, for one po, was locked down in the US for 5.5 months. And it is true po na isa po rin ako sa umuwi na walang pera. After ma-lockdown doon since March. Tapos na-repatriate po kami with the help of the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C. and Polo, Washington, D.C. Doon po kasi ako nagkaroon ng channel on how to help these people. Tapos word came out that I was able to help people to get their ACA. Hanggang sa lumaki na po ng grupo ko. Tapos nag-evolve na po yung grupo ko into a community organization na who's helping OFWs. We would just like to know what are our entitlements and how can we connect with the proper agencies so that we may be heard and we may be helped. Kasi po, Polo, Washington, D.C. has been helpful to us, especially, it has been helpful to me immensely kasi po, they were the ones who connected me with certain organizations po. Pero I would just like to broaden my network po para mas matulungan at ma-address po yung mga kailangan. And I'm so thankful to Dawn kasi I may be the one dito lang yata na parang hindi government organization. Na para to further help these people kasi what we are doing is providing webinars, tying up with different organizations and institutions to provide livelihood projects for them. And pero syempre we can only do so much. Kaya I would just want to know the right information, the legitimate information para po mas maiayos namin kasi po we are doing our best to uplift, to enrich, empower, and educate our OFWs po, both men and women, para po to cope with this pandemic po. Ayun lang po. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to respond? Or otherwise, we have room for one more sharing. Kasi mag-wrap up na tayo. Kasi maganda yung pinag-uusapan natin nakakapag-share ng mga challenges. Anyone? I think everyone has already shared their information, which is very important. Okay. So I think it's nice na to hear from you guys yung mga challenges na nafe-face nyo before and after during COVID. And at least we are here to share what we've learned. Kasi from our end, meron kami mga inputs na pwedeng i-share. The other groups also have something to share. But at least this is a good environment for us to learn and help each other at this trying time. So thank you very much that we've learned so much from you, from our speakers, from our participants of what's really happening in the field. and also to our people sa DSWD for what's happening naman locally and also overseas sa mga ginagawa niyong assistance na pinaprovide. So thank you very much, and may I call back again Ma'am Mel to close us.
Thank you very much, Lance. Maraming salamat sa ating lahat, no? Napaka-interactive o napaka-fruitful ng ating discussions and sharing. At in closing, no, we would like to thank our two distinguished speakers, si Professor Aurora Habati de Dios at saka si Dr. Jean Encinas Franco, for their very comprehensive presentations, very informative, and of course si Mr. Lance Velasco for facilitating our open forum. Thank you din of course sa lahat ng participants, no, ng second training workshop natin on gender-based violence and migrants' rights. Maganda yung ating talakayan ngayon, pero siyempre, di ba, may mga ibang schedule din yung iba nating mga participants. So that's why we would like to close this session. We would like to invite you, however, sa third training workshop natin on basic counseling techniques, empathy, and compassion building. Ito ay sa Tuesday, November 24. Ang speakers natin ay si Dr. Jet Jurisprudencia ulit and Dr. Paz Manaligod, ang ating speakers trainers. Sila yung speakers natin nung 17 no, ng November. So hope you can all join us. And sana we will also have more discussions for the remaining two workshops, training workshops. So again, thank you very much. Let's all keep safe. Salamat po.
Thank you.
Thank you so much po.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
you again
Thank
po.
you.